My grandfather hid a secret for 50 years and only revealed it after his cancer diagnosis. What he told me changed everything. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The city lights flickered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan Carter's apartment, casting fractured shadows across his polished marble floor. He sat at his dining table, laptop open, fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass of untouched bourbon. His suit jacket was still on, tie loosened just enough to signal he was home, but not yet off duty. The merger papers for a European client needed review by morning. Work never waited. Neither did Ethan. It had been years since anything disrupted his precise routines, years since he'd felt anything that couldn't be soothed with deadlines and decimals. That night was supposed to be like any other. Until the phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something, instinct, maybe, or the stillness in the air, made him swipe to answer. Mr. Ethan Carter. The voice on the other end was soft, female, with that restrained tone professionals used when delivering bad news. Yes. Speaking. My name is Teresa. I'm calling from Crestfield Medical Center. You're listed as the next of kin for Mr. Walter Carter. Ethan blinked, confused. The name felt foreign and familiar all at once. My grandfather? He asked slowly, as if saying it might change the answer. Yes, sir. He was admitted 2 days ago. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He listed you in his advance directive. He's been asking for you. Ethan stood up without realizing it, heart pounding louder than the city outside. I wasn't aware, he muttered. We haven't spoken in years. I understand, but he's lucid, and he's asked for you by name, more than once. There was a pause on the line, the kind that carries weight. I thought you should know, Teresa added. Ethan didn't remember ending the call. He didn't remember grabbing his keys or leaving the documents half-signed on the table. He only remembered the cold elevator ride down, the doorman's startled look as he passed by, and the hum of the taxi engine as he muttered, Crestfield Medical. His grandfather, the man who had raised him from the age of 11 after the car crash that took his parents. The man who taught him how to ride a bike, how to tie a tie, how to look someone in the eye and tell the truth, even when it hurt. And the same man who, one day, simply stopped answering Ethan's calls, who didn't show up to Ethan's graduation, who vanished from birthdays, from holidays, from everything. It had been 12 years since Ethan last saw him. 12 years of silence, and now he was dying. The hospital sat on a quiet street Ethan didn't remember ever driving down. The white walls looked almost golden under the sodium lights, peaceful in a way that made his skin crawl. He gave his name at the front desk. The nurse, tired, kind, too young to carry such gravity, guided him down a hallway that smelled faintly of antiseptic and overcooked broccoli. He's awake, she said, stopping outside the room, and he's expecting you. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. He stared at the door handle for a long second before opening it. There he was, Walter Carter. Older, frailer. The broad shoulders Ethan remembered had shrunk into the mattress. His face was lined like aged paper, and his eyes, once the sharpest part of him, were glassy with exhaustion, but they lit up when he saw Ethan. You came, Walter whispered. Ethan stepped inside, unsure of his feet. You asked for me. Didn't think you would, Walter said, and I wouldn't have blamed you. Ethan stood at the edge of the bed, unsure if he should sit or speak or simply turn around and leave. I was angry, Ethan said finally. You disappeared. Walter nodded slowly. I did. No explanations, no letters, no calls. I know. Ethan clenched his fists, then released them. 12 years. Walter looked at him, and for the first time in forever there was something vulnerable behind those eyes. Not regret exactly, more like weight. The kind a man carries in silence until it breaks him. I didn't know how to tell you, he said. Tell me what? Walter smiled faintly. I will, but not tonight. I'm tired, and the words, they deserve more strength than I have right now. Ethan pulled up a chair, sitting beside him for the first time in over a decade. "I don't know if I came here to forgive you," he said honestly. "I didn't expect you to." They sat in silence. No machines beeped in the room, just the quiet breathing of an old man and the broken rhythm of memories echoing in the sterile space. Walter turned his head slightly. "Thank you for coming, Ethan. I mean that." Ethan looked down at his hands, wondering how the hell one is supposed to feel when they realize someone they loved and resented might be dying. "I don't know what I'm doing here," he admitted. "That's okay," Walter said, eyes already closing. "Maybe we'll figure it out together." The hospital room was dim, lit only by the glow of a lamp over the bed. Ethan sat in the same chair he had pulled up the night before, unsure why he hadn't just gone home. Something had anchored him there. Not obligation, not duty. Something more elusive, like a string pulling from deep inside his chest, connecting him to a man he no longer understood. Walter hadn't woken since their conversation. His sleep was shallow, disturbed by soft coughs and the occasional twitch of a hand. Every so often he whispered something unintelligible, a name maybe, a memory, a piece of another life. Ethan stared at the IV line snaking into his grandfather's thin wrist, at the heart monitor whose green waves rolled across the screen like lazy ocean tides. For most of his life, Walter Carter had seemed unbreakable. He had been a Navy officer, a contractor, a builder, a man who fixed things with his hands and didn't talk about feelings. He was made of routine, 6 a.m. jogs, black coffee, local news. He never forgot an oil change. Never let dishes sit in the sink. He had never been late, never raised his voice, never hugged for longer than necessary. When Ethan was a teenager, he used to resent how distant Walter could be, but in hindsight he realized that his grandfather had been a fortress, a man holding himself together for the sake of someone else, for him, and then one day he'd vanished from Ethan's life. Not physically, not at first, but slowly, deliberately, until the only trace left were the silence between holidays and the empty chair at college graduation. For years, Ethan thought he'd imagined the connection they once shared. Maybe it had only existed in his own childhood, mind, a hopeful construction. But now, watching Walter lie there, fragile and fading, that version of the past didn't feel so imaginary anymore. A nurse came in quietly around 6 a.m., checking vitals and changing a saline bag. Ethan stood and stepped back to let her work. "He's been resting more today," she whispered. "Might be the medication, or the body preparing." Ethan didn't ask what she meant by preparing. "He seems calmer now that you're here," she added, then paused. "He talks about you in his sleep sometimes." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What does he say?" The nurse smiled gently. "Nothing clear. Just your name mostly, and apologies." Ethan swallowed hard. "Thanks." When she left, he returned to the chair, staring at the tiled floor for a long time. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he pulled out his phone and canceled all his meetings for the next 2 days. It surprised him how easy it was. No one questioned it. No assistant pushed back. The world outside kept spinning without his input. He leaned back, watching his grandfather breathe, steady but labored. Ethan noticed a small leather-bound notebook peeking out from beneath a stack of magazines on the bedside table. Curiosity drew his hand before he could second-guess it. The cover was worn, the leather cracked and soft. When he opened it, he found no notes, no medical logs, just a single photograph tucked between the pages. It was old, a black-and-white print folded at the edges. A younger version of Walter stood next to a woman Ethan didn't recognize. Her hair was in soft curls. Her smile was wide. Her hand rested gently on Walter's chest, like she belonged there. Ethan stared at the image. It wasn't his grandmother. He knew that instantly. She had died before he was born, and every photo of her showed a different woman, more severe, more composed. The woman in this picture looked nothing like the stoic family matriarch he'd heard stories about. This woman looked alive, light-hearted, warm. He flipped the photo over. Written in faded ink was a name. Annabelle, July 1973. Ethan's brow furrowed. Who the hell was Annabelle? Before he could fall deeper into speculation, Walter stirred. His eyelids fluttered. A hand shifted slightly beneath the blanket. Grandpa? Ethan leaned in, voice tentative. Walter's eyes opened slowly, watery and unfocused. But when they found Ethan's face, something clicked into place. You stayed, he rasped. I did. Walter smiled weakly. Didn't think you would. I wasn't sure either. A pause. Can I ask you something? Ethan said, pulling the photo from his lap and holding it up. Walter's eyes locked onto it. And for a moment, it was like a different man emerged beneath the sickness. His face softened. His mouth parted slightly in something between awe and grief. Where did you find that? He asked. In your notebook. Walter's voice cracked. That's not just a picture, Ethan. That's the beginning. That's where everything started to go wrong. Who is she? Walter didn't answer right away. He turned his head slowly toward the ceiling, blinking rapidly. Then, with the thinnest whisper, he said, She was the love of my life, and the greatest mistake I ever made. Ethan stared at him, a million questions storming through his mind. Annabelle, Walter said again, as if the name itself carried gravity. I haven't spoken it aloud in over 40 years. The silence returned like a curtain falling. Ethan looked at the photograph again, then back at his grandfather, whose eyes had closed once more. This wasn't just about cancer, or aging, or dying. This was about something else, a secret, a name buried for decades, a weight his grandfather had carried for so long it had changed him. Ethan didn't know what was coming, but he knew, deep in his chest, that the man in that bed was not the man he had believed he knew. He was something else entirely, and Ethan was finally ready to find out who. The hospital room was quiet again, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint beep of a machine tracking Walter's heartbeat. The photo of Annabelle rested on the side table, carefully placed where Ethan could still see it. He hadn't asked any more questions. Not yet. Somehow silence felt more appropriate. Ethan stayed most of the morning, reading news on his phone, pretending to scroll when his eyes mostly hovered on Walter's face. Every so often the old man shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Once, Ethan caught his own name again. Another time it was Belle. The name had weight now. When a nurse brought lunch, Walter stirred. She offered broth, but he waved it away with trembling fingers. His strength was visibly declining. Are you in pain? Ethan asked softly. Walter opened one eye. Only in places that can't be medicated. There was a bitterness in his voice, subtle but unmistakable. Ethan didn't push. He hadn't earned the right to prod into wounds not yet offered. Still, the silence between them gnawed at Ethan. It wasn't like the old angry silence that stretched across years. This one felt unfinished. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the clouds shifted over the city, casting long shadows on the sidewalks below. When I was little, Ethan said, his voice almost hesitant, you used to tell me that men don't cry, that we hold the line, stay composed. Walter's eyes moved to him slowly. I was wrong about a lot of things. I believed it for a long time. Ethan turned back toward the bed. Even after you stopped showing up, after you disappeared from my life, I still believed it. I told myself you had your reasons, that maybe I'd done something wrong. Walter winced. No, Ethan, no. You didn't do anything. That was me. I know, Ethan replied, not harshly, just stating the truth that had long gone unsaid. A pause stretched between them. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Walter said finally. I left because I couldn't bear to be seen. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Walter struggled to sit up slightly, and Ethan rushed to adjust his pillow. The old man's breathing was slower now, each word a small mountain. When your grandmother passed, I thought I had made peace with my life, that I'd followed the path I was meant to walk. But grief opens old doors, doors you thought were locked. He turned his head, eyes glassy but alert, and behind one of those doors was Annabelle. Ethan felt his breath catch. She wasn't some affair, Walter added quickly. Not in the way people use that word. She was before everything. Before your grandmother. Before the Navy. Before I became someone I didn't recognize. Ethan sat down again, the weight of the conversation sinking into his chest. I loved her, Walter whispered, but life pulled us apart, and I made a choice I regretted every single day. You said she was a mistake, Ethan said carefully. No, Walter corrected, losing her was the mistake. They sat in that heavy quiet for a long time, both men processing different kinds of pain. Ethan thought of all the years his grandfather had carried this alone, whatever this was, a broken love, a secret, a legacy of silence. You could have told me, Ethan said at last. Walter's expression turned pained. And what would I have said? That your strong, stable grandfather had a second life filled with shadows and shame. That I lived the last decades of my life trying to forget someone I never could. You could have said you were human. Walter gave a sad smile. By the time I realized I should have, I'd already lost you too. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I hated you, you know, he said flatly. Walter didn't flinch. I hated how you just vanished. I hated that I kept wondering what I'd done, and then one day I just stopped feeling anything at all. That's the worst kind of pain, Walter said softly. When you stop feeling altogether. Ethan nodded, staring down at the floor. I wanted to be better than you, he admitted. I thought building a life full of achievements and zero emotion would protect me. But it didn't. Walter looked at him, eyes full of quiet sorrow. We carry the same armor, you and I. They stayed in silence again, this one deeper and more understanding. There was no fixing what had already been broken. But in the space between them, something cracked open. Ethan reached for the photo on the table. You said she was the love of your life. Walter's eyes didn't leave the picture. She was more than that. Then why did you leave her? Walter looked away, his voice almost inaudible. Because I was afraid. And when I finally had the courage to go back, it was too late. Ethan said nothing, because deep down he knew that sentence would come to define much more than a single love story. It might define everything. That night Ethan couldn't sleep. He'd gone home for a few hours to shower and rest, but his mind kept circling back to the photo, the name Annabelle, the sadness in Walter's eyes, the heaviness of a love that had never left, even after 50 years of silence. When morning came, he returned to the hospital early. A different nurse greeted him, and the room felt dimmer than before. Walter was asleep again, pale and still, but peaceful, almost like a man waiting for something. Ethan sat down and opened the drawer where he'd found the leather notebook. There was more inside than he'd noticed the first time. Tucked beneath, the notebook was a bundle of old yellowed envelopes tied with a thin ribbon now frayed with age. He hesitated, heart pounding. They weren't addressed. No stamps. Just aged paper sealed with care. He untied the ribbon. The first letter began simply, Annabelle, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Ethan's hands trembled. The handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's, sharper than now, but familiar in its structure and pressure. He began to read. August 3rd, 1974, Annabelle. I passed your street today. I told myself I wasn't going there to see you, that it was coincidence, habit, anything else. But the truth is, I needed to feel close. To you again. You weren't outside. You're probably gone by now. Married, maybe. Maybe you've forgotten me the way I begged myself to forget you. But I haven't. I can't. I still hear your laugh in my sleep. I still think of the way your hair fell into your face when you painted. I can't step into a gallery without wondering. If your work is there, hidden behind a name I'll never recognize. I've made choices I thought were right. I told myself that duty mattered more than desire. That responsibility came first. That love could wait. But it didn't. And it won't. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve to be remembered. But if I never say this, it will rot inside me forever. I loved you. I never stopped. Walter Ethan finished reading and just sat there. The letter was raw, unfiltered, vulnerable in a way he never imagined his grandfather could be. This wasn't the quiet, composed man who fixed broken cabinet doors and watched the 6 o'clock news without emotion. This was someone else, someone younger, someone heartbreakingly human. He read through 2 more letters, each written in different years, one from 1977, another from 1981. The words changed, grew older, more tired, but the message remained constant. I saw someone today who looked like you. My heart stopped. Sometimes I dream that you're waiting for me, that we're older, slower, but still laughing. I don't know how to let you go. Letter after letter, all unsent. Dozens of them, some written in hotel stationery, others on notebook pages torn from journals. One even scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt. Annabelle was the woman who lived in the corners of his grandfather's mind, the woman he'd never forgotten, the woman whose absence had turned into a shadow he never escaped. And Ethan had never heard her name until 2 days ago. The letters weren't dramatic. They didn't plead for a reunion. They were confessions into the void. Tiny anchors cast into time, hoping to tether meaning to a life full of controlled regrets. When Walter stirred that afternoon, Ethan didn't mention the letters immediately. He helped him sip water, adjusted his blanket, and waited. Eventually, Walter spoke first. You found them, didn't you? Ethan nodded. I did. Walter didn't ask what he thought. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, I never sent them because I was too late. Always too late? She never answered. Walter turned his face toward the window. I don't know. I never gave her the chance. Ethan looked at the man before him, worn by time, grief, and secrets, and felt something strange. Not pity. Not anger, empathy, I think, Ethan said slowly. You wrote them for yourself. Walter opened his eyes again. They were the only thing that kept her alive in my mind. A quiet pause passed between them. Why now? Ethan asked. Why tell me now? Walter looked at his grandson with the clarity of a man running out of hours. Because secrets poison everything. Because I don't want to die with her name buried in my throat. Ethan swallowed hard. He had always believed his grandfather was distant because he didn't care. But now he saw the truth. Walter Carter wasn't emotionless. He was a man who had loved too much and spoken too little. And now, at the end of everything, he was trying, finally, to speak. Did she know how much you loved her? Ethan asked. Walter's voice cracked. I hope so. A week after the hospital visit, Ethan returned to his grandfather's house. Walter had insisted on being discharged early, though everyone, including the doctors, knew it wasn't because he was healing. It was because he wanted to go home. To die on his own terms, Ethan didn't argue. He simply drove him back, helped him settle into the old recliner in the living room, and made sure his medication was within reach. The hospice nurse arrived daily, always quiet and respectful, as if she knew the walls of this house held more than just furniture. They held memory. Late that night, Ethan wandered the house alone. There was a stillness that felt different than silence. Every object seemed to breathe history. The uneven scratches on the kitchen table where Walter had taught Ethan to play checkers, the faint smell of motor oil clinging to the garage, and the creaky floorboard that always gave away a midnight snack. He walked into the den, a room that had been untouched for years. Dust coated everything. Books lined the shelves, untouched since the days his grandmother was alive. A brass lamp stood beside an armchair, and a crocheted throw blanket lay folded neatly across the seat, like it was waiting for someone to return. Then he saw it, a small framed photograph on the mantel. He walked closer. It wasn't a picture of his grandmother. It was Annabelle. She was young, probably in her 20s, her dark hair pulled back, eyes full of mischief and warmth. She was laughing at something outside the frame, and though the picture was black and white, Ethan could almost see the color in her cheeks. It was tucked behind another frame, nearly hidden from view. He picked it up carefully and turned it over. No date. No name. Just a single line in his grandfather's handwriting. The summer I almost chose myself. Ethan stared at the words. It was the kind of sentence that begged questions, regret woven into every letter. He took the photograph back into the living room. Walter was awake barely, his breathing shallow. "Who took this?" Ethan asked, placing the frame on the coffee table. Walter's eyes flicked to it. His lips curved faintly upward. "She did." "You kept it hidden." Walter exhaled through his nose. "Your grandmother never knew." "I loved her." "I did. But not the way I loved Annabelle." There was no defensiveness in his tone, no guilt, just honesty. "Do you regret staying?" Walter didn't answer immediately. He reached for his glass of water, sipped it, and looked at the photograph again. "I regret the silence more than the choice." Ethan nodded. It made sense now. The way Walter had withdrawn over the years. The way he'd become quieter, less engaged. As though he'd been living next to his own life instead of inside it. "She wrote me once," Walter added after a pause. "Years after I'd married your grandmother. Just one letter." Ethan leaned in. "What did it say?" Walter's eyes misted. "It said she forgave me." The words were so soft Ethan almost didn't hear them. She said she understood. That life doesn't always give us what we want, but sometimes we still love it anyway. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Do you still have it?" Walter shook his head slowly. "I read it once. Then I burned it." "Why?" "Because I knew if I read it again I'd go looking for her. And by then it was too late for both of us." The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Outside, a soft breeze rattled the leaves. Autumn was beginning to show itself in the rustling trees and cooler nights, a season of letting go. Ethan sat in silence, staring at the photo. "I don't want to end up like you," he said finally. Walter chuckled weakly. "Smart boy." "I mean it." Ethan continued. "I've spent so much of my life pushing people away. I thought it made me strong. Now I see it just makes me lonely." Walter's gaze softened. "It's not too late. It was for you." Walter nodded, his fingers curling slightly on the blanket. "That's why I'm telling you, so it doesn't have to be for you." They stayed like that for a while. Two men, one at the end of a long road and one just beginning to understand the price of walking it alone. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "What was she like?" he asked. Walter smiled, and for a brief moment the years fell away from his face. "She was art and thunder. A storm I wanted to live in." Ethan let the words hang between them like a final verse of a song unsung. He looked at the photo again, at the smile that had haunted Walter for a lifetime, and he thought to himself, if love can survive 50 years of silence, maybe it never truly dies. The rain came without warning. Ethan was in the kitchen, making tea the way Walter liked it, too bitter for most palates, but exactly how he'd grown up drinking it. The hospice. Nurse had gone for the evening, and the house was unusually still. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows, slow at first, then steady, then relentless. He carried the mug to the living room, where Walter sat upright in his recliner, wrapped in a quilt his late wife had stitched decades ago. His breathing had grown shallower with each day, his body shrinking into the shape of a man nearly done with time. "I made you some tea," Ethan said softly. Walter opened one eye, giving the faintest nod. "Smells awful, just right." Ethan chuckled as he placed the cup on the side table. But before he could sit, a sound startled them both. A knock at the door. It was almost 9 p.m., and the neighborhood had long since gone to sleep. Ethan stood still for a moment, uncertain. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. He opened the door. A woman stood there, soaked from the storm. She was elderly, perhaps in her late 70s, with silver hair tucked under a rain-spattered scarf. Her coat clung to her body, drenched and heavy. But it was her eyes that froze Ethan in place. Bright, steady, familiar in some way he couldn't quite name. I'm looking for Walter Carter, she said, her voice clear despite the rain. Ethan blinked. He's inside. May I ask? I'm Annabelle, she said. The name struck him like thunder. Please, he said quickly, stepping aside. Come in. She entered, removing her scarf and gently shaking out her coat. Despite the years, there was a grace to her movements, a quiet strength that seemed to carry her forward even now. Ethan led her into the living room. Walter hadn't moved. He stared at her as if he were seeing a ghost. Then, slowly, his lips parted. Belle, he whispered. Her eyes welled with tears. Hi, Walter. No one spoke for a long time. Ethan stood in the corner, unsure whether to leave or stay. But neither of them acknowledged him. Their entire world had shrunk to the space between their eyes. You came, Walter said, voice trembling. You wrote me for 30 years. Annabelle replied gently. It took me 50 to find the courage to answer. Walter's lips quivered. I thought I was too late. Annabelle stepped closer. You were, and somehow, you weren't. Walter reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation. I don't understand, Ethan said finally, his voice barely more than a breath. Annabelle turned to him, her expression kind. I read every letter, she said. I kept them, all, every word he wrote after he left. You never wrote back, Ethan said. I did, she answered softly, but I never mailed them. Walter closed his eyes. We were both afraid. We were both proud, she corrected. Ethan watched. As they settled into a silence that didn't feel empty this time, it felt earned. The kind of silence that only comes after decades of longing and forgiveness folded into one another. Annabelle sat beside him, her hand never leaving his. I'm not here to restart anything, she said. We're past that. I just wanted to tell you that I forgave you. Not because you asked, but because I needed to. Walter turned his head toward her. I never stopped loving you. I know, she said, smiling through her tears. That's why I'm here. Ethan felt the ache in his chest rise, but not from sadness, from something deeper, a reverence. He was witnessing something rare, a full-circle moment that most people never live long enough to see. Walter looked at Ethan, his eyes clear for the first time in days. I want him to know everything, he said to Annabelle. She nodded. He should. Then stay, Ethan said. Please, stay the night. Annabelle hesitated, but when Walter gave her hand a gentle squeeze, she nodded. Ethan made up the guest room and left them alone in the living room, where 2 chairs faced the fireplace. Though the flames were gone, the warmth between them lingered. He peeked in once before going to bed. Walter had fallen asleep with his head leaning toward Annabelle's shoulder. She sat awake, eyes closed, humming softly, a tune Ethan didn't recognize but somehow understood. The rain outside softened into a whisper, and in that quiet, something inside Ethan shifted. He saw, finally, the full story of his grandfather. Not the man who had disappeared from holidays and birthdays. Not the man who sat quietly through decades. But the man who had loved deeply and imperfectly. The man who had tried. Too late for a second chance, but not too late for the truth. The next morning, Ethan found them just as he'd left them. Walter and Annabelle were still in the living room, though they'd shifted slightly, her hand now resting gently on his knee, his fingers curled around hers like roots refusing to let go of the earth. They didn't speak when Ethan entered. They didn't need to. Their silence had a language all its own. Coffee? Ethan asked quietly. Annabelle smiled, nodded. Walter simply closed his eyes in affirmation. While it brewed, Ethan moved about. The kitchen without his usual morning rush. Everything felt slower now, each movement deliberate, like he didn't want to disturb the air that had settled in the house. A kind of peace had wrapped itself around the space, fragile but real. As they drank their coffee by the window, Annabelle finally broke the silence. You look like your mother, she said to Ethan. He nodded. I've heard that my whole life. She had Walter's eyes, always searching for something. Walter chuckled faintly. She found it, though. That's more than I can say. Annabelle tilted her head. Did she? There was no malice in her question, only depth. An invitation to consider the lives that had sprouted in the shadow of Walter's choices. She loved you, Ethan said. Even when you weren't easy to love. Walter looked away, guilt softening his features. I never meant to be absent. I just didn't know how to show up. I thought staying silent kept people from getting hurt. Annabelle sighed. That's the lie we tell ourselves, isn't it? That silence is safer, kinder. But really, silence is just empty space where truth should be. Ethan nodded. You left a lot unsaid. Walter looked at him. I know. Then, say it, Ethan said. While you still can. Walter glanced down at his hands, now thin, translucent. They no longer looked like the hands that once built shelves, tuned radios, or flipped pancakes on Sunday mornings. They were hands that held secrets too long. I wasn't there the way I should have been, Walter began. Not for your mother. Not for you. I let fear write too many chapters of my life. Fear of what? Ethan asked. Walter's eyes met his. Fear that if I allowed myself to love fully, I'd lose everything I'd built on duty and reputation. That people would see I was soft underneath it all. You were human, Annabelle said gently. Walter nodded. But I didn't act like one. The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was sacred, like the air itself understood something old was being laid to rest. I didn't come back to rewrite the past, Annabelle said after a moment. That's gone, but I did come back to remind you that love wasn't wasted, even if it was silent. Walter's breath shook. I wish I had said it out loud more. To you, to my wife, to my daughter, to Ethan. You still can, Annabelle whispered. He turned to Ethan. I've never told you this, but I used to stand outside your bedroom door when you were a baby, just listening to you breathe. Your mother said I looked like a guard dog. Ethan smiled despite himself. I didn't know how to hold you without feeling like I might break you. Walter continued. I was so scared to do it wrong that I ended up doing nothing at all. And that was worse, Ethan said softly. Walter nodded. I thought if I just provided, bought you nice things, helped with school costs, that it would be enough. But love doesn't work that way. It's not a ledger. It's not a transaction. Annabelle placed her hand over his. It's presence, she said. Walter turned to her, his voice rough. I wish I'd stayed. Back then. I wish I'd chosen us. You did choose, Annabelle said. And so did I. We chose other lives. But we also chose not to forget. Ethan stood, walking toward the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world damp but fresh. A new day, cleansed by water and time. Do you regret telling me all this? Ethan asked, turning back to them. Walter shook his head slowly. No, you deserve to know who I really was, not just the version I showed. You're more than your silence, Ethan said. Walter's eyes moistened. And so are you. That afternoon, Ethan retrieved the old letters and gave them to Annabelle. She held them like sacred scripture, fingertips trembling as she opened the ribbon. She didn't read them then. She simply closed her eyes and held them to her chest. I thought they were gone, she said. I thought I'd imagined them. They were real, Ethan said. All of it was. As the sun dipped below the trees and twilight poured in through the windows, Annabelle whispered something so quiet Ethan barely heard it. I forgive you. Walter smiled, and for the first time in Ethan's life, he saw his grandfather cry. Not the silent, hidden tears of a man too proud to show weakness, but real tears. Cleansing tears, tears that washed away a lifetime of unspoken things. Walter didn't wake up the next morning. He was still breathing, shallow, ragged, but unconscious. The nurse arrived just after sunrise, her expression confirming what Ethan already sensed in his bones. He's transitioning, she said gently. He may have hours, maybe a day. Annabelle didn't cry. She simply sat beside him, brushing a hand through his thinning white hair. Every once in a while, she whispered something close to his ear. Ethan didn't ask what. He knew those words weren't meant for him. By mid-morning, the house had filled with a soft hush. Time itself seemed to slow, stretching between heartbeats, between breaths. Ethan wandered into the garage, a place he hadn't visited in years. Dust blanketed the workbench, cobwebs clung to the corners, but there, resting against the far wall, was an old cedar chest. He pulled it toward the light and lifted the lid. Inside were pieces of a life no one ever spoke of. A worn baseball glove, a stack of yellowing newspaper clippings from Walter's time as a young factory supervisor, a folded American flag in a glass case, and tucked at the very bottom, a sealed envelope with Ethan's name written on it in trembling handwriting. He stared at it for a long time. Then he opened it. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, or close enough that the things I never said are pressing too hard to stay buried. You know, it took me nearly my whole life to realize that regret doesn't come from the things we fail to achieve. It comes from the things we fail to feel. I spent so many years trying to be strong, thinking that strength meant silence, distance, stoicism. But that's not strength. That's fear in a different coat. I want to tell you something I never had the courage to say in person. I'm proud of you. Not because you made money, not because you built a name, but because I see in you the man I wished I'd been when I was young, still afraid maybe, but brave enough to change. Don't let my silence become your inheritance. Tell people how you feel, especially when it's hard, especially when it matters. And don't be afraid to love deeply, even if it breaks you sometimes. Love's the only thing I took with me in the end. Everything else faded. There's something for you in the closet of the den. I've kept it all these years. With love." Grandpa Ethan stood still, the letter trembling in his hands. It was the most his grandfather had ever said to him in one sitting. And it wasn't spoken. It was written, left behind like a time bomb of emotion, waiting for the moment Ethan would be ready to feel it. He went to the den. In the back of the closet, behind old coats and a rusted tackle box, he found a box wrapped in faded green cloth. Inside was a leather-bound journal. On the cover, burned into the leather, were the words, "For the family I never stopped loving." The first entry was dated 1974. Ethan flipped through the pages. Memories poured out in ink. Moments Walter had never shared aloud. His first date with Annabelle. The night his daughter, Ethan's mother, was born. The day he received the call about Annabelle's wedding to someone else. The year he almost drove across the country to find her and didn't. Regret etched into every page, but also love, deep, enduring love. A love that never vanished, only waited. By the time Ethan returned to the living room, the sun had started to dip low on the horizon. Annabelle was still at Walter's side, holding his hand. "I found the journal," Ethan said, softly. She smiled without turning her head. "I was hoping you would." Walter's breathing slowed, then a whisper, a gasp of effort. "Ethan," he murmured. Ethan knelt quickly, leaning close. "I'm here," he said. Walter's eyelids fluttered open for the last time. His voice was a rasp of wind. "I loved you the whole time." "I know," Ethan whispered, his own eyes stinging. "I love you too, Grandpa." Walter gave the faintest smile, and then he was gone. Just like that. The house fell utterly still. No beeping machines. No final words. Just the quiet exhale of a man who had finally said what needed to be said. Annabelle leaned over and pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Goodbye, my storm," she whispered. Ethan stood and walked to the window. The first stars were appearing in the sky. The kind of night Walter had always liked best. Clear, cold, full of space to breathe. And then Ethan realized something. His grandfather hadn't left him an inheritance of land or wealth or things. He'd left something far more precious. Permission. Permission. To be human. To feel. To speak. To risk loving someone before it's too late. It was the final gift, and Ethan vowed he wouldn't waste it. 3 months later, the house felt different. Not emptier, just quieter, like it was catching its breath. Walter's recliner remained in the corner, untouched. A folded American flag rested on a small table beside it, next to the last photo taken of him and Ethan together. Walter smiling, frail but luminous, with Ethan's hand on his shoulder and Annabelle behind them, eyes soft with memory. Ethan had considered getting rid of the recliner, but something stopped him. It wasn't just furniture. It was the seed of a life rediscovered too late, yet not too late at all. He kept the journal too, reading a few entries each night before bed, like bedtime stories written for him decades in advance. He never rushed. Each page felt like a conversation, across time. The funeral had been small. Walter hadn't wanted anything elaborate, just a modest gathering, a few hymns, and space for people to remember him as he was. Not perfect, but honest. People came, quiet people, neighbors, a few old co-workers, and the hospice nurse who whispered afterward, "He wasn't ready to go until you forgave him." Annabelle stayed for a week after. They walked the neighborhood together in the evenings, Ethan supporting her arm, when her legs tired. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. On her last night before returning home, she turned to him beneath the porch light. "You changed him, you know." Ethan smiled. "I think he changed me, too." She pressed a small envelope into his hand. "I wrote him back. One last letter. If you ever feel lost, read it." He tucked it into the journal and hugged her tightly. "Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," she admitted, voice trembling. "But I'm glad I did." Then she was gone. Ethan returned to the life he had left behind, but he didn't return the same. His phone rang less. By choice. He didn't fill every moment with movement. He began volunteering at the local hospice. Just small things at first. Organizing bookshelves, bringing tea, holding hands during hard conversations. But every face reminded him of Walter, and of the time they almost lost, then found. One evening, as he sorted through a box of his grandfather's old tools, he found a dusty photo album labeled Unfinished Projects. Inside were snapshots of half-built birdhouses, crooked benches, and shelves that never made it to a wall. A younger Walter appeared in many of the photos, always mid-smile, always mid-process. But at the back of the album was a blank page. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up the pen and wrote. Started again in the heart of his grandson, completed daily through kindness. The next day, he walked into a local elementary school with a folder tucked under his arm. "Hi," he told the receptionist. "I'd like to start a mentorship program here for kids without grandparents. Weekend visits, stories, woodshop, maybe even some gardening." She blinked at him in surprise. "We can call it Grandfather Great Love." A few months later, he sat on the school's sunlit back porch with a little boy named Mateo, sanding a block of cedar together. "Did your grandpa teach you this?" the boy asked. Ethan smiled. In a way, they worked in companionable silence. For a while before Mateo asked, "What's it like having a grandpa?" Ethan paused, then said, "It's like having someone who sees the best in you, even when you don't see it yourself, someone who's not afraid to cry when it matters, someone who teaches you that love isn't measured in time, but in honesty." Mateo nodded like he understood more than his age should allow. Later that night, Ethan pulled out Annabelle's letter. He'd been waiting for the right moment. He opened it under the porch light where Walter used to sit. "Walter, you were always a storm in my life. Sometimes loud, sometimes distant, sometimes breathtaking. I spent years convincing myself I was better without you. But when the quiet came, I missed the thunder. I forgave you long before you asked. Not because you deserved it, but because love asked me to. That's what love is, Walter. Not a reward. A choice. Thank you for teaching Ethan what I once wished you'd taught me. Maybe that's how the world heals. In generations, not moments. I'll meet you again someday. Maybe in a house made of cedar and starlight. Until then, be at peace." Ethan folded the letter, tears blurring the ink. He looked out at the yard, where the garden had begun to bloom again. He heard Walter's voice in his head, low and steady. "Don't let silence be your inheritance." He wouldn't, every weekend with Matteo. Every time he shared Walter's stories, every time he said, "I love you," without shame or hesitation, he'd be rewriting the ending. Because the truth was this: a secret kept for 50 years didn't die. With Walter, it bloomed, in forgiveness, in legacy, in love passed down like an heirloom too precious to keep hidden. It wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, and Ethan would spend the rest of his life making sure that love, quiet, flawed, but powerful, was never left unsaid again. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you've lost, or someone you still have time to love, don't let the moment pass. Subscribe to Grandfather Great Love for more emotional stories that remind us what truly matters. And in the comments below, tell us. What would you say to your grandfather today if you had one more chance? We read every word. We're building a community of memory, forgiveness, and love, and you're a part of it now.